When I was a kid growing up, I spent most of my time playing games on Nintendo consoles. While I also owned an original Xbox as a kid, the Nintendo 64, DS, and Wii were my go-to consoles for new gaming experiences. However, that changed in November of 2016 when I purchased a PlayStation 2 along with Sly Cooper and the Thieves Raccoonus. It was one of the most unique platformers I had ever played, instantly making me a PlayStation fan. Not long after that, I purchased a PlayStation 3, and one of the first games I got with it was Uncharted Drake's Fortune. Uncharted was unlike any experience I had with a game before. The charming and well-written characters, the bright, vibrant environments, the climbing mechanics, and the score all added up to be one of the most exciting gaming experiences I would ever have. Soon after I finished Drake's Fortune, I went on to play both Uncharted 2 Among Thieves and Uncharted 3 Drake's Deception on the PS3, which I also loved. Uncharted quickly became one of my favorite video game franchises for its characters and gameplay. The feeling of playing through what was essentially an interactive Indiana Jones film is one that I will never forget. After that, a few years had passed since I finished Uncharted 3, and I was itching to play the final game in the Nathan Drake storyline, Uncharted 4: A Thief's End. Then, in 2019, I graduated high school and found a part-time job, so with some money I had saved up, I finally purchased a PlayStation 4 and Uncharted 4. Returning to the Uncharted series on a brand new console felt like I was coming home from a long journey because Uncharted 4 is one of the best finales to a video game franchises I've ever seen. And I also played Lost Legacy as well, but we'll get to that. It's safe to say that this series holds a special place in my heart for many reasons, so I thought that I'd give it the look back it truly deserves. With that said, I'm Arin the Wolf, and this is an Uncharted Retrospective. Greatness from small beginnings was the motto of legendary explorer Sir Francis Drake, meaning anyone can achieve great things no matter where they started. This statement also applies to the creation of the Uncharted series. After completing the final game in the Jak and Daxter series, Jak 3, Naughty Dog decided to move its focus on developing games for the upcoming PlayStation 3. They started working on a project under the codename Big. Originally they were going to make another Jak and Daxter title, but they felt that the more realistic looking approach strayed too far from the more stylized look of Jak and Daxter. So instead, they decided to create a brand new series that could work with the more realistic art style and the better graphical power of the PS3. They decided to make an action-adventure game in the same style as Indiana Jones and National Treasure. Not only that, but game director Amy Hennig chose to forego the typical tough-as-nails action hero similar to Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone's characters. Instead, she wanted to create a character that was more along the lines of Indiana Jones and John McClane from Die Hard. In other words, tenacious, resourceful, but vulnerable. The game was first revealed at E3 2006, where many people who played it compared it to the Tomb Raider series, which had a similar action-adventure tone. Despite the similarities, game journalists were impressed by the giant leap in graphical quality from the PS2 to the PS3.
And I'm sitting there and I'm playing it, and all of these games journalists gathered around me, and we all marveled at the fact when Nate walked into water and walked out, his pant legs were wet. That's the bar of where video games were at a decade ago.
The game was written by Amy Hennig, Josh Scher, and Neil Druckmann, the last of which would go on to direct The Last of Us and Uncharted 4 later down the line. Uncharted Drake's Fortune received both critical and commercial success. Critics praised the game not just for its revolutionary visuals, but also for the clever writing and character interactions. But just like Sir Francis Drake, there's more to it than what history tells us. So let's finally talk about the game that started it all, Uncharted Drake's Fortune. The game begins with the coffin of Sir Francis Drake being discovered off the coast of Panama. Reporter Elena Fisher is filming thieving treasure hunter Nathan Drake, who claims to be the descendant of Sir Francis Drake. As Nate opens the coffin, they find it to be empty, all except for a small chest containing Francis Drake's journal, Not long after, the two are attacked by pirates but manage to hold them off long enough for Nate's partner in crime, Victor Sullivan, to rescue them. Now safe on an island, Nate tells Sully about a secret island containing a long-lost treasure he believes Francis Drake found and hid the location of centuries ago, the lost city of gold, El Dorado. The two ditch Elena and head towards the island. As they explore the jungle and the ruins beneath it, they discover that El Dorado is actually a gold statue and has been removed from its original resting place. After finding a map in a German U-boat that leads to a secret island, Nate and Sully are ambushed by a criminal named Gabriel Roman and his lieutenant Navarro. Nate manages to escape their grasp, but not before Sully is presumably shot dead, in which Nate eventually bumps into Elena once more. The two head to the secret island, and from that point on, Nate and his companions discover the secrets of El Dorado, once found by Francis Drake centuries ago. Although simple, Uncharted's overall structure does an excellent job of keeping the player engaged through it all. The thing that any Uncharted player will tell you is that what makes Uncharted memorable is not its stories, but its characters. Nate, Elena, and Sully are all well-developed, charming, empathetic characters whom you want to see succeed. A big reason for the characters' charm is the cast. Nolan North, Emily Rose, and Richard McGonagle do a fantastic job selling the characters for who they are. One of Uncharted's most prominent technological advances from other action-adventure games is the use of motion capture. Motion capture is a technology that can go wrong very easily in most mediums. The character's movements can come off as either unnatural or fall into the realm of the uncanny valley. In other words, it's not hard at all to mess up motion capture, but Uncharted 1, for the most part, makes the character's movements feel natural. The animators went into painstaking detail to ensure that you feel the impact whenever a character is flinching or hurt. The realistic movements whenever the characters are running away from gunfire or flinching from the punches they're taking are a nice touch that sells the reality of whatever situation the characters might be in. As I said before, this game was praised for its outstanding graphical capability. This ranges from the realistic lighting and shading changes as Nate traverses through the environment, the way the water ripples as Nate swims through it, and, as Greg Miller has said before, the way that when Nate walks out of water, his clothes will appear wet. The version you're seeing right now is the PS4 remaster from the Nathan Drake collection, but even on PS3, Uncharted is one of the most graphically impressive games of its time. Another big factor in this game's selling immersion is the soundtrack. The score was composed by Greg Edmondson, who's most prominently known for his work on Firefly. He created a score that perfectly encompasses the sound of an Indiana Jones film. Plenty of action games at the time were going for more rock or metal and techno pieces in their music. Edmondson took a different approach to this, opting to create a soundtrack that sounded like what you would find in a typical action-adventure film orchestra: strings, percussion, brass, and woodwind instruments. His approach to keeping the music ambient is one I think paid off. The music the player hears when exploring the island really sells the atmosphere the game sets up. On top of all that, Uncharted's art direction is much more vibrant and colorful than any of its gritty, bleak counterparts. The environments need to stand out from one another, not just to stand out from other games in the market, but also to make it easy for the player to find the next path. Uncharted as a series can be divided into 3 different gameplay elements: gun combat, climbing and exploration, and puzzle solving. First off, gun combat is fairly standard for games of this era. Some of Uncharted's biggest gameplay inspirations consist of Resident Evil 4 and Gears of War. What makes the Uncharted series stand out from those games, however, is its sense of movement. Combat encounters are designed in a way that doesn't let you stay in one spot for too long. Enemies will run further toward your location if you spend too long in one spot, and some bits of cover will even break away if they take too much damage. As far as the guns are concerned, there is a decent variety to choose from. Pistols, shotguns, sniper rifles, revolvers, and even grenade launchers. That said, the catch with Uncharted is that you're always switching out different weapons in combat. Enemies will drop whatever weapon they were using when they die, and your weapon's ammo reserve will only last so long. This keeps the pace of the combat fast, since you need to make sure you kill the enemies as fast as you can with as little ammo as possible. Occasionally, you'll be shooting things while driving vehicles. These levels range from on-rail shooters to driving a jet ski up the river. Combat-wise, these are the weakest parts of the game. If they're not completely monotonous, they're tedious as hell. In the jet ski sections in particular, having to stop and aim to shoot things really bogs down the pace of the game, especially with the stiff jet ski controls. The second element of Uncharted is climbing and exploration. You'll usually be climbing up different terrain in between all the action. Sometimes you'll even have to climb during the action. The climbing mechanics feel snappy and responsive, while also having enough weight to them so that you can barely make it across a gap when you jump over it. Although the climbing in the first Uncharted is fairly standard compared to the games later down the line, it still works well enough to be engaging. Plus, the climbing sections allow the developers to flex the game's graphical capability even more. Parts of the wall will usually be colored a certain way so that you know what's climbable or not. Once again, the graphics do a good job of leading the players through the set pieces while still keeping the immersion in check. Throughout the game, you can also find hidden treasures scattered across the game's locations. These treasures add a nice incentive to explore every nook and cranny you can find. That said, these treasures are, at the end of the day, optional. They don't contribute much outside of the little bonuses you get after finding a certain amount. This statement also applies to the entire series as well, so keep that in mind. Lastly, every so often you'll be solving different puzzles. Frankly, the puzzles in the first Uncharted are the weakest in the series. Most of them are over before they even get started, since you could just look up in Francis Drake's journals to find the answers. It's the game's equivalent of just looking up the answers online, which is really disappointing. All three of these gameplay styles mix together to make an incredibly satisfying gameplay loop that keeps you engaged the entire time. That said, how it's handled in Drake's Fortune could have used some fine-tuning. One of my biggest issues with the first game is how the balance of the combat, climbing, and puzzles is poorly executed. I'd say that 70% of Drake's Fortune is just shooting people. No joke, it feels like there's a mob of enemies every 5 minutes, which gets annoying after a while. Whenever I look back at what I remember in this game, most of it is just the combat. Granted, the combat is well done here, but the game just needed more variety to keep it from getting stale. Thankfully, the series would get better at this as it went on, but as far as the first game is concerned, it gets a little repetitive after a while. But that doesn't compare to what my biggest issue with the game is: the villains. Roman and Navarro are some of the most forgettable antagonists I've ever seen in a game. The only reason they're here is that Sully let slip that he and Nate were searching for El Dorado. Because of that, Roman and Navarro aren't villains, they're just obstacles. It doesn't help that we rarely see them in the game. I can only recall 3 times they show up before the finale, which really shows how worthless these characters are. But hey, if 2 forgettable villains weren't enough, how about a 3rd one named Eddie Raja? I mean, look at him. What even is this character? I'm pretty sure he only has 10 minutes worth of screen time in the entire game, which begs the question of why they thought this character was needed. When the player isn't tense when any of these villains have Nate and company cornered, that's kind of a problem. If you ask me, what they should have done is focus on just one villain, give them more screen time, and actually have them either be threatening or entertaining. Regardless, these villains suck, and it's a common problem with the series, but we'll get to that soon enough. The villain's lameness all manifests in the game's climax. After discovering the Germans' base on the island, Nate discovers that what Francis Drake found is the golden statue holds a terrible curse, and that anyone who breathes in the dust of the corpse inside becomes a mindless zombie. After they find that Roman and Navarro have already found the statue, Navarro tricks Roman into breathing in the corpse dust, and Roman is killed by Navarro once he becomes a zombie himself. Realizing what would happen if the statue reached the mainlands, Nate runs and climbs to the statue being carried by a helicopter, which eventually crashes onto a boat, leading to the final boss of the game. And frankly, it's a complete joke. All that happens is that you go through waves of enemies while avoiding Navarro's insta-kill shotgun until you eventually have him cornered at the top of the boat. All you do is just jump from cover to cover and eventually beat him up in a series of QuickTime events. Oh yeah, I guess QuickTime events were also a thing in this game, but they happen so infrequently that I didn't even bother talking about them. And just like that, Navarro is down. That's it. That's the final boss fight. Dude, you have the brilliant Robin Atkin Downes playing you. This is just embarrassing. His leg gets caught on a wire attached to a helicopter, and he falls down into the ocean along with the Golden Man statue. A fitting end for such a forgettable villain. Also, Eddie Raja died too, I guess. Whatever, I don't care. As far as the first game is concerned, it's probably my least favorite in the series. While it is the game that started it all, and I'm grateful that it came out when it did, it is a little repetitive and unfocused for my liking. I still love the game, forgettable villains and all, but it's definitely the one I want to revisit the least out of them all. 7 out of 10. Pretty good, but very flawed. But hey, if the first game is my least favorite, then that means the series only gets better from here on out. And well, it did. After the critical and financial success of Uncharted Drake's Fortune, Naughty Dog knew they had to make a sequel and quickly got to work on it. Uncharted 2 Among Thieves was first revealed by Game Informer in 2008 and then later showed at PlayStation's conference in E3 2009. From the looks of it, Uncharted 2 was set to be bigger and better in every aspect. More locations, more weapons, bigger set pieces, and on top of that, better graphics. The game spent 22 months in its entire development, 6 of which were spent in just pre-production. Naughty Dog's hard work paid off in the end, as the game received even greater acclaim than that of the original. While players and critics liked the first game overall, many of them consider Uncharted 2 to be one of the best games ever made. As of writing this script, Uncharted 2 is ranked number 29 on Metacritic as one of the highest rated games of all time. Financially, it almost doubled Uncharted 1's 4 million sold units, with 7 million units sold. Everyone and their grandmother loved this game, which begs the question, what is it about this game that people loved so much? Well, let's take a look. Uncharted 2 Among Thieves has one of the best openings in any game I've ever played. Nathan Drake wakes up wounded on a train hanging off a cliff in the middle of the snowy Tibet. He's only just barely able to climb to safety before passing out. We then cut to 3 months prior, where Nate is sitting at a bar on a beach, where he is discovered by a former associate named Harry Flynn, along with his girlfriend, Chloe Fraser. The two of them talk to Nate about their client paying them for a heist in a museum in Istanbul to steal a Mongolian lamp and that Nate would be perfect for the job. Nate refuses at first, but quickly changes his mind after he discovers the lamp could be connected to the treasure of the lost fleet of Marco Polo. The three manage to sneak into the location of the lamp, and in the lamp find some flammable resin and a map that reveals that Marco Polo's fleet was lost somewhere near Borneo. As it turns out, the fleet was holding the legendary Chintamani stone originating from the lost city of Shambhala. Once the two start to leave, Harry Flynn betrays Nate and leaves him to be caught by the museum security. 2 months later, Nate is brought out of prison by his old friend Victor Sullivan and Chloe Fraser. Obviously hesitant to trust Chloe at first, Nate refuses to listen. That is, until Chloe reveals to Nate that Flynn is working for a Serbian war criminal named Zoran Lazarevic, who is also after the Chintamani stone. And throughout the course of the game, Nate and company travel all over Asia for clues on the stone's whereabouts, eventually reuniting with Elena Fisher in Nepal and race Lazarevic to get to the stone before he does. In terms of the story, Uncharted 2 is a significant improvement over the first game. While the plot of Drake's Fortune was solid, it wasn't super complex, not helped by the pace of the game. Uncharted 2's story does a great job of keeping the player on the edge of their seat. Because of how massive Lazarevic's army is and how dangerous Lazarevic himself is, the stakes are always held high, which is a good thing for an action-adventure story. Graphically speaking, Uncharted 2 is one of the best looking games on the PS3 by a long shot. A big reason for that is the scale. Uncharted 2 easily trumps Uncharted 1 in terms of sheer size of its locations. While the first game took place on just a few islands, Uncharted 2 takes place in several Asian countries: Istanbul, Borneo, Nepal, and Tibet. Nepal especially looks enormous in this game, thanks to Naughty Dog pushing the PS3's power to its absolute limit. Once again, you are seeing the PS4 remaster, but the only difference here is that the game runs smoother and the textures are a little cleaner. Everything else is all the PS3. The way each location is lit and colored gives you a sense of the environment around you. This is especially true for the icy caves in Tibet. The white and blue colors all perfectly give you the sense of the treachery of the terrain, as well as just how cold it must be for Nathan Drake to endure. Compare this to the first game, where it was primarily green jungles and brown and gray caves. Each and every one of Uncharted 2's locations and set pieces feels fresh and exciting to explore. Do you know what else is a massive improvement over the first game? The soundtrack. Greg Edmondson returns as the series composer, bringing a brand new approach to the orchestra this time. While the first game's soundtrack was more focused on ambiance with the percussion and brass instruments, Uncharted 2 brings a nice variety of songs to complement the scenarios we see Nate go through. For example, the song Breaking and Entering has a much slower tempo with strings and brass as the focus, making for the perfect song for sneaking through a heavily guarded museum. In contrast, the song Helicopter and Tank is way more bombastic and faster paced, giving the player an adrenaline rush as they make their way further down the train while being attacked by Lazarevic's men and even a freaking helicopter. But the ambiance of the first game's soundtrack has not gone away. Far from it. Broken Paradise plays once you and the gang manage to escape from Lazarevich himself and are left to wander the ancient yet alien world of Shambhala. This song does an excellent job of making you feel like you're trespassing in a civilization that was never meant to be discovered by humankind. Finally, A Rock in a Hard Place perfectly encompasses the feeling of helplessness as Nate first arrives in Tibet. Shot, bleeding, not much strength left, this song drives home just how bad things have gotten for Nate at this point. I know I've spent a lot of time talking about the soundtrack, but Uncharted 2 has one of the best video game soundtracks of all time. Listen, I don't throw best of all time lightly, so believe me when I say that this orchestra's sheer variety and composition are awe-inspiring. Hands down the best soundtrack in the series. Now, how does the gameplay hold up? Well, in terms of pacing and overall design, it's much better than the first Uncharted. As I said before, Uncharted 1 was primarily focused on combat, and while the combat was fun in that game, having to deal with enemies every 5 minutes kind of got tiring after a while. Uncharted 2 is far more balanced with its gameplay elements. Sure, the shooting is still there, but now there are entire game sections dedicated to the puzzles and climbing. This keeps the pace of the game fresh so that whenever the action does happen, it has more impact than it would otherwise. As far as the combat itself is concerned, Uncharted 2 puts much more emphasis on stealth this time around. Stealth barely worked at all in the first game, once again, due to how often you encounter enemies. In Uncharted 2, not only are there plenty of opportunities to sneak around enemies, but you also earn extra ammo drops for stealth kills, giving you an extra incentive to be as sneaky as possible. You might want to try stealth kills anyway because Uncharted is significantly harder than the first game. Not by too much, but your mistakes are far more punishing this time around, especially on harder difficulties. Enemies in this game are not only a bit more aggressive this time, but they also come in more flavors. Rocket launchers, armored baddies with shotguns, and eventually goons with miniguns, helicopters, and even a freaking tank at one point. Once again, this perfectly showcases just how large and dangerous Lazarevich and his army are. Other than that though, it's the same combat as the first game, but just better designed overall. And there is no better example of that than the entirety of the train sequence. While it may be a linear pathway, I assure you it is far from easy. You have 2 different floors of the train with enemies on both parts, limited amounts of cover because of the train, you have to outmaneuver a helicopter early on and eventually you'll be able to take it down using a tank in one of the carts. There's even a moment where you have to traverse the top of the train while avoiding all the incoming signs quickly. Simply put, this entire sequence is designed to put your skills to the test since it's so easy to mess up and die, and it's one of my favorite parts of the Uncharted series. With all that being said, I've neglected to talk about one specific part of Uncharted 2 that really elevates it to a whole new level: the characters. Firstly, we have one of Uncharted's best characters, Chloe Fraser. Chloe is a more complicated individual with a dry sense of humor. Director Amy Hennig once described Chloe as the darker side of Nathan Drake, and that's evident through her interactions with not just Nate, but with Elena when she shows up again. One of Nathan Drake's defining characteristics is that he won't leave a man behind. This is most prominently shown on Chapter 11, Keep Moving. Elena's cameraman Jeff has just been shot, and Nate helps him try to escape alive without hesitation. Meanwhile, Chloe keeps trying to get Nate to leave him there for dead, insisting that it'll only slow them down. I mean, Jeff ends up dying anyway, but the fact is, this shows us just how much different Nate and Chloe's moral codes are. Nate is a thief, but an honorable one. He won't kill for any reason other than self-defense, and he always wants to make sure everyone gets out alive. Chloe, on the other hand, says screw all that. You don't need anyone else. They're only gonna get in the way. Hell, even Lazarevich taunts Nate for not being willing to kill someone in cold blood, further emphasizing Nate's true character. He's not just a petty thief, he's willing to do the right thing no matter the cost. When it comes to the other characters, Harry Flynn is actually a pretty entertaining asswipe, even after his betrayal. There's just something about how witty yet petty he is that makes him such a joy to hate. Then there's the main villain, Zoran Lazarevich. While he's a much more prominent and intimidating threat than whoever the hell the villains were in the last game, he still isn't very deep of a character. I mean, he even goes off on how he wants to be like a bunch of infamous dictators of the past.
Genghis Khan, Hitler, Stalin, Pol Pot, they were all great men. But do you know why they prevailed?
I'm sure you're gonna tell us.
So yeah, it's not very subtle at all. I know subtlety isn't exactly the series' strong suit, but you'll see what I mean when we get to Uncharted 4. Overall, while he isn't the deepest of the villains out there, he's still an intimidating menace that further motivates Nate and the player to stop him from reaching the Chintamani Stone. Such a shame that his boss fight is kinda ass though. While it isn't Navarro's lousy final boss, it still leaves a lot to be desired. You have to constantly run away from him while blowing up the nearby tree sap to damage him. Do this 12 times in a row, and the boss is yours. So yeah, not terrible, but not impressive. After leaving Lazarevich to die from the inhabitants of Shambhala, Nate runs across a crumbling bridge as the city of Shambhala collapses in the background. Nate, Chloe, and Elena, despite being wounded as hell, all manage to make it out of the lost city alive. With no treasure to show for their efforts, Nate and Elena decide that maybe there is something between the two of them that can work, leaving the fate of these characters, at least for now, uncertain. In short, Uncharted 2 Among Thieves is one of the best games of the 7th console generation. With its engaging narrative, fun mix of gameplay, and graphical power, it's no wonder why this game is held in such high regard. It's simply a masterpiece. Unsurprisingly, due to the critical and financial success of Uncharted 2, which was greater than the first game, Naughty Dog wasted no time getting to work on a third game, starting development in 2010. This time, however, things were being handled a bit differently. Naughty Dog decided to split its developers into two different teams, one to work on Uncharted 3 and another to work on an original game that would soon be known as The Last of Us. Now, regardless of how you feel about The Last of Us and the people behind it, the game unquestionably made Naughty Dog a gaming titan due to its success. Because of that, however, Uncharted 3 would only have about a year and a half in total development. Uncharted 3 was set to feel larger and more open than the last two games. It also decided to stand out from Uncharted 1's jungles and Uncharted 2's snowy mountains by putting Nathan Drake in the desert, taking inspiration from the adventures of real-life archaeologist Thomas Edward Lawrence. Now, even though it's impressive that they made this game with their circumstances, it's still a very hit or miss game for me. How so? Well, let's discuss. Uncharted 3 starts pretty differently this time around, with a more cinematic, edited opening. Nate and Sully walk into a bar in London with no rabbi or priest, but instead meet with a man named Talbot, who wishes to buy Sir Francis Drake's ring from Nate. When the two realize, however, that the money being used to buy the ring is fake, things get heated quickly. After brawling their way out of the bar, they're cornered by Victor Sullivan's former employer, Catherine Marlowe. Marlowe steals the ring, and Talbot's right-hand man, Charlie Cutter, shoots them in the chest, with Talbot and Marlowe driving off. We then cut to a flashback showing how Nate and Sully first met, thankfully with no terrible Mark Wahlberg this time, while also establishing how Nate and Sully know Marlowe. We cut back to the present, and as it turns out, the whole thing was a setup by Nate, Sully, and Cutter to give the villains a fake ring to find their secret hideout. Joined once again by Chloe Fraser, the gang finds their underground lair and uses Drake's ring to find a map. The map reveals that Sir Francis Drake went on a 6-month expedition to find the lost city. Now, the city goes by many names, but it's always said to be a city of immeasurable wealth, punished by God for its arrogance, swallowed forever in the Rubal Khali Desert. Hey, wait a minute here. They're just using the same plots over and over. What kind of a cut-right production is this? For real, this plot as a whole is kind of derivative in more ways than one. I mean, it's at this point where I realize just how similar the plots of Uncharted 1, 2, and 3 really are. Nate and crew finding a lost city? Check. Nate survives a crash and gets stranded? Check. The lost city, as it turns out, is hiding an ungodly power the villains want to use to their will? Check, check, check. I understand that this game was made in a year and a half, but the plot here is so derivative from the last two games that it's frankly distracting. Hell, the game itself realizes it's done all this before.
So, wait, if Drake was on a mission from the Queen to find this place, why all the secrecy? I mean, it looks like he went to a lot of trouble to hide whatever he found, even from Her Majesty.
I don't know. Oh, I'm sorry. What was that?
No, hang on a second. Because if you recall, the last time we went halfway around the world searching for a lost city, things got more than a little dicey.
Regardless, Nate and the game team up to find the clues on the location of the Atlantis of the Sands, once again meeting up with Elena later on, and eventually put an end to Talbot and Marlowe's plans. Uncharted 3 is a game that leaves me feeling conflicted. In terms of its gameplay, it's as strong as ever. In terms of its story and characters, it honestly kinda sucks. And yeah, we just really need to discuss what's so sloppy about it. I've already mentioned the fact that the plot is derivative as hell, but the story has problems even without that. For one thing, Chloe and Charlie feel kind of worthless in this game. Both of them, Charlie especially, are basically written out of the game after the first act. Charlie broke his foot from a fall in Syria and is never seen again in the entire franchise. Chloe was lucky enough to get her own game, but Charlie only gets a single mention in Uncharted 4, which is severely disappointing. Even Chloe doesn't have the same kind of contrast that she had in the last game. She's not really there to challenge Nate's moral code anymore, she's just kind of there. Frankly, you could remove both of them from the game and not much would really change. I should also mention the copious amounts of weird things that are never explained at all in this game. There's this corpse of one of Talbot's men that looks like it's been rotting for decades despite only just getting here. That's never explained. There's also this one moment where after making Cutter have a psychotic breakdown, Talbot literally disappears into a stone wall. Yeah, even for Uncharted, this is complete bullshit. Talbot has quite a habit of just showing up where the plot needs him to, even if it's completely illogical for him to be there. Also, these swarms of spiders constantly follow Nate and co in different locations for no reason. It's things like all that that make me realize just how rushed this game's narrative truly is. And we're not even done talking about the story's issues yet. The whole theme of this game is that the villains are controlling their enemies through fear. This is an interesting concept that ultimately feels half-baked in the end. Nate at one point is shot with a hallucinogenic dart. Now, Marlowe earlier asks Nate what he truly fears, since he clearly gets off from the danger of his adventures. This could have been a great insight into Nate's motivations, but all that ends up happening is that Nate just runs around tripping balls for 10 minutes. That's another thing. All the other characters start to question why Nate puts so much pride and obsession into finding treasures, wondering why he can't just let it go. Again, an excellent opportunity to flesh out Nate as a character, wasted by poor execution. The game kind of just drops this plot point towards the end where they eventually find the Atlantis of the Sands. The game's story as a whole feels rushed, derivative, and half-baked. I remember hearing something about how when it came to Uncharted 3, the set pieces were chosen first and the story was written around them. I don't know how true that is, but it honestly wouldn't surprise me. This whole game's story is just so poorly executed that it's honestly kind of laughable. Yet somehow, Uncharted 3 went on to win a Writers Guild Award for Outstanding Achievement in Video Game Writing. I think the joke speaks for itself here. So yeah, the story here is kind of garbage, plain and simple. A story with a lot of great ideas, squandered by rushed development and poor execution. While the story of Uncharted 3 is very flawed, the game itself is arguably one of the best looking games on the PS3. Again, this is part of the PS4 Remaster Collection, but it's just cleaner textures and a smoother frame rate. Besides that, this game really shows us what the PS3 is capable of. Another big reason for choosing a desert setting was so they could push the PS3's graphical capabilities even further, and it paid off. Some of the set pieces in this game, such as the cargo plane sequence, traversing the cruise ship, and the Atlantis of the Sands, are all breathtaking with their graphical detail. The way that the sand naturally shifts as Nate traverses through the Rural-Kali Desert really sells the terrain of this game. If there's one thing I have to give Uncharted 3 credit for, it's undoubtedly the graphics and environments. The soundtrack, while not as varied as Uncharted 2, is also very well done. This soundtrack is what I consider to be the most immersive of the series, with the composition truly making the villages and desert wastelands feel a lot more treacherous than they would be otherwise. Museum Bus is one of my favorite tracks in the game. It starts out more laid back as a young Nathan Drake traverses the rooftops to get to the local museum and retrieve Francis Drake's ring. But then, as Nate is being chased by Marlowe's men, the music picks up as a Spanish guitar takes the forefront of the track and gives us a sense of urgency while still keeping the immersion up. It's one of the few Uncharted music pieces that stood out to me, even when playing the game for the first time in 2017. Now, as far as the gameplay is concerned, there isn't too much of a difference from Uncharted 2, which shows just how much Uncharted 2 refined the gameplay. Still, this game has at least some new things to discuss. In gun combat, the game introduces the silencer pistol, which is excellent to use with stealth. It's a shame that it's only in a handful of places in the game, as it's fun to be sneaky with. You can also throw enemy grenades back at them, which wasn't necessary, but I'm glad that it's still here regardless. However, the melee system is the biggest change in this game's combat. Melee combos were always pretty janky to do. The games tried to get you to do specific combos for melee attacks, but it just wouldn't register a good portion of the time. Uncharted 3 attempts to fix this issue, as it now has specific button commands for defending from and attacking enemies. The game puts you in plenty of moments where melee combat is the only way out, and this is something that peaks in the opening. Yeah, while I appreciate them giving more purpose to the melee combat, it's still only a last resort in most situations. I mean, using it in areas where enemies have powerful guns is pretty much a death sentence. Even if it wasn't, killing enemies this way simply takes too long. Stealth killing them or hitting them with a headshot is not only faster, but more rewarding. And while I'm on this topic, the shipyard. This section is easily the worst set piece in all of Uncharted. Not only is it utterly pointless in the grand scheme of the story, but all the water and the shifting terrain of this place make finding cover a hassle to do. Given the game's direction and development, it's clear that this section was put in just so they could show how good they can make the water look. Ironically, the water doesn't even look that much better than it did in the previous games. And I know I've talked enough about how messy the story is, but this section introduces a pirate named Ramses. This guy somehow has even less screen time than Eddie Raja in the first game, which is kind of an accomplishment. The award for the most worthless Uncharted character goes to this guy. But yeah, this whole section of the game is just a giant waste of 2 hours, and frankly, the setting was becoming an eyesore after the first hour. When it comes to the puzzles, I am happy to report that they are some of the best in the series. The answer to most of these isn't as simple as look in Drake's journal for the answers, as it is in Uncharted 1. Here, you have to think about what you're doing and can't just brute force your way through it. The many puzzles in the Chateau in France are all very well done and require a good amount of thinking to solve, as puzzles should. The final thing I want to mention is that this is the Uncharted game where I encountered the most bugs. And no, I don't mean those spiders that are somehow everywhere in the game. I mean technical bugs. There was one cutscene in the game that straight up didn't load the audio, resulting in a completely silent cutscene. This clip, by the way, is not edited.
I'll need a torch to light it.
And then there was this one part in one of the last sections of the games where I straight up did a Dragon Ball Z teleport. So yeah, apparently Uncharted 3 is the buggiest game in the Nathan Drake collection, with the completionist in particular having a tough time completing the game because of how buggy and unpolished it got. But in short, Uncharted 3 Drake's Deception is a game that has good intentions, which unfortunately are squandered by rushed development, lack of utilization of its ideas, and it's just a sloppy, unfocused game overall. While I still liked playing it overall, and Uncharted 1 is still my least favorite, Uncharted 3 is easily the weakest game in the Uncharted series. Oh, you're saying I haven't even talked about the villains, Talbot and Marlowe yet? Well, truth be told, they're the worst Uncharted villains ever. They barely even have a presence in the game themselves, and honestly, they feel like characters with nothing to offer. Not even Robin Atkin Downes' performance can save how forgettably awful his character is here. If the game doesn't care to show its villains more, then neither will I. They're trash. Plain and simple. Despite the many issues with Uncharted 3, it went on to receive universal critical acclaim, won tons of Game of the Year awards, and sold over 6 million units. Because of this, Naughty Dog believed they still had enough power in them to make one last Uncharted game and quickly got to work. In between all of this, however, Naughty Dog released a prequel game called Uncharted Golden Abyss for the PlayStation Vita. I admit that I do not own a PS Vita or Golden Abyss, so I won't be looking at it in depth for this video. That said, I did want to at least mention the game, seeing as how I'd probably get flack for it if I forgot. Going back to Uncharted 4, Amy Hennig and Justin Richmond worked on the development for several years until eventually departing Naughty Dog in March of 2014. Speculations about them being forced out of the company were shared, which co-presidents Evan Wells and Christoph Balestra denied. Regardless, development was then handed to Last of Us directors Bruce Straley and Neil Druckmann. The two apparently scrapped 8 months worth of Amy Hennig's story, which was concerning for development. The game would only have about 2 years of total development time left, so starting over after so much time in development seems like a recipe for disaster. Sure, the two created Naughty Dog's most critically acclaimed game, The Last of Us, but Uncharted had been around for years. How would they be able to make a game that fits the tone of Uncharted while also making the characters more complex and interesting to the players? It just seems impossible. I mean, the last thing any storyteller wants to be in an ongoing franchise is the one who screwed everything up. Well, the game finally came out for the PlayStation 4 in May of 2016, and honestly, they nailed it. Uncharted 4: A Thief's End went on to receive universal acclaim, with many seeing it as the best game in the entire series, including me. It also went on to become the best-selling Uncharted game of all time, selling more than double Uncharted 2's numbers with over 15 million units sold. It even went on to win 2 different game awards, one for Best Narrative and another for Best Performance by Nolan North. This game simply knocked it out of the park in every way possible, from its refined combat, its new and refreshing set pieces, and what's this? An actually good villain? What kind of witchcraft is this? But let's not get ahead of ourselves. What was it about this game that worked so damn well? Oh boy, do we have a lot to talk about. Now, I'm going to preface this and say I'm going to talk about the story of the game last, since I think it's the most important part of the game, and we'd be here a while if I started out with it. So in the meantime, can I just say that this game looks amazing? I thought Uncharted 2 and 3 were graphically impressive, and they are for the PS3, but this game blows them out of the water. This game looks better than real life. I can't even imagine how much work must have gone into making the environments feel massive and alive. The many buildings you find throughout your journey are dusty and look like they could collapse in on themselves at any moment. The quaint little village in Kings Bay looks bustling with activity. My point is, this game looks absolutely incredible. You know what else is incredible? The soundtrack. Greg Edmondson didn't compose the music this time around. Instead, we have Henry Jackman to thank for it. Henry has a plethora of work under his belt, from composing the Kingsman films, to several DreamWorks films, and even Disney's Wreck-It Ralph. Safe to say, this guy's got plenty of experience with cinematic scores, and luckily, his score fully understands the tone Uncharted always goes for with its music. Uncharted 4's music is also the most melancholy soundtrack of the franchise, matching the creative direction of Neil Druckmann. Tracks like A Normal Life provide a more grounded sound to the game and establish a new theme for Nate and Aleda's relationship with them being married. Simply put, the soundtrack is phenomenal all around. Not as varied as Uncharted 2's soundtrack, but it's definitely my second favorite in the series. I also have to give credit to this game's incredibly crisp sound design too. All the guns in this game have never sounded better. Frankly, it sounds about as good as an action movie, which makes it that much better. Moving on to the gameplay, Uncharted 4 is still the same great mix of combat, puzzles, climbing, and exploration we all know and love, but refined to near perfection. The most significant introduction to this game's mechanics is the grappling hook. Grappling hooks are relatively common when it comes to adventure games, but since Uncharted is already about climbing as is, I'm sure a lot of you would naturally be worried that it makes climbing too easy. Well, no. Far from it. The grappling hook is merely an extension of Nate's abilities and makes for some of the trickiest climbing sections in the entire game. I love that about this mechanic. It doesn't make the climbing any easier, but instead opens up many more possibilities for the game to test your reflexes. The gun combat encounters have also received a significant change in terms of how they're laid out. Combat encounters in the original 3 games were almost always done in linear lines. In Uncharted 4, the encounters are mostly designed in circles. You'll usually get much wider areas for taking out enemies, either stealthily or guns blazing. The linear encounters are still there, but there's more variety in how you handle them this time around. One of the most prominent inclusions in Uncharted 4 is the Jeep. During certain parts of the game, you'll drive around Africa in a Jeep to help you traverse it more easily. The Jeep's winch can also be used in exploration and puzzle solving. Later on, you'll also get to drive a boat across the water. While it's not as versatile as the Jeep and you can only use it in one section in the entire game, it's still a nice inclusion. I like these vehicle segments quite a lot. Once again, they're mostly extensions of the core of Uncharted, which is how it should be. And all of these gameplay additions and improvements culminate in one of the best sequences in all of Uncharted, the Kings Bay chase scene. This entire segment is everything great about Uncharted. The stakes are made clear. Nate and Sully need to meet up with Nate's brother Sam, we'll get to that, before they're either killed or captured by Rafe Adler. Again, we'll get to that. Nate and Sully try to get through the town quickly until Rafe's hired private army Shoreline catches them. Nate and Sully manage to shoot their way out and get into the Jeep to escape, but then are suddenly being chased by a freaking armored van. They race through town, barely dodging the van, and Nate manages to grapple to a crane that the army has and just barely manages to hold on as he's being shot at and dragged across the mud. Nate then goes from car to car, killing all the goons in his way until he finally manages to catch up to Sam. But oh shit, the armored van came back and crashes Nate's car! Nate makes it out right before the car explodes and hops onto Sam's motorcycle, but that damn van won't let up. Nate just keeps shooting it with all the ammo he has left until finally...
Holy shit. Yeah.
That was awesome! This entire sequence is why I love this series. The pure adrenaline I get from playing through it all and making it through by the skin of my teeth is the kind of thrill I live for with these games. This is basically the train sequence from Uncharted 4, but fully realized. Simply put, I love this game for this one sequence alone. But fortunately, that's not the only reason why I love it so much. Let's finally talk about the story and characters. Since Neil Druckmann was the creative director of this game, you could certainly feel the influence of The Last of Us on this game. Usually I'd say that this causes the game to take itself way too seriously, but that's not the case here. Druckmann realized that Uncharted's story, on the surface level, is very ridiculous, and it plays into that. But let's discuss the newest addition to the story, Nate's long-lost brother, Sam Drake. Sam is played by lead actor of The Last of Us, Troy Baker. Phenomenal voice actor, not that great of a person, but anyway. The long-lost brother trope is one that's usually done by incompetent writers when they have absolutely no idea where to take the story next, even though the original characters have never even mentioned a brother before, so this frankly should not work here, and yet it does. The game does a great job explaining why Nate wouldn't have mentioned a brother before, and why Sam needs to be here in this game. You see, Nate and Sam grew up as orphans because their mother committed suicide because of an illness she couldn't control, which was actually briefly mentioned in Uncharted 3, but anyway. Afterwards, their father dumped them at an orphanage, where Nate would be picked on by the other kids. One day, the two of them find out from an old partner of their mother that she was a brilliant historian, and this is where we find out where Nate got his belief of being the descendant of Sir Francis Drake. Yes, Nate's real name is Nathan Morgan. But shortly after telling the brothers this, the old lady dies of a heart attack, and Nate and Sam are forced to escape the police. Obviously not being able to return to the orphanage, Sam devises a plan to forge papers and get their last names changed to Drake. And the rest is history. That's cool and all, but we still don't know where Sam's been this whole time. Well, years later in a Panamanian jail, Nate, Sam, and their partner Rafe Adler are searching old buildings hidden from the prison for Henry Avery's treasure location. Nate manages to find a cross with a model of St. Dismas, the penitent thief that died next to Jesus during the crucifixion.
During the crucifixion, Jesus is placed between two thieves, okay? One of them mocked Jesus. The other one, this guy, was penitent. He accepted his punishment with grace.
And Jesus brought him to paradise.
The three manage to brawl their way through some inmates until the prison warden, who's been secretly working for them, takes them into his office. When he demands a cut of the treasure, Rafe happily responds by stabbing him in the side, killing him. Oh, trust me, we'll get to Rafe Adler. This all causes a breakout in the prison. Nate and company race through the maze of the prison, and we eventually get to a point where Nate has to pull Sam up to escape until...
Sam, no. No, you hold on! Hold on! Sam! Give me your other arm! on, reach! No! Sam!
This is why Nate has never mentioned a brother up until this point. He was forced to leave his brother behind to save his own skin. He felt guilty for what happened to his own brother. As such, he didn't want to be reminded of the mistake he thought he had made. This is why, 15 years later, after the events of Uncharted 1, 2, and 3, and Nate and Elena having been married after all that, when Sam returns and meets his brother for the first time in over a decade, he feels relieved, albeit briefly. As it turns out, Sam just broke out of the same prison with drug lord Hector Alcazar. In exchange, Alcazar gives Sam 3 months to find the treasure and split the profits, or die. Nate is hesitant at first, seeing how he and Elena swore off the dangerous adventure life, but Sam convinces him that only Nathan Drake can save him. So Nate and Sam meet up with Sully for one last time, and the three set out on an expedition for Henry Avery's treasure after all these years. So yeah, there's a lot. We would be here longer than we already are if I went more in depth with this game. Part of me wants to make a separate video talking about Uncharted 4's story alone and why it's so great. In the meantime, I'm going to put a link in the description for StoryStreet's Uncharted 4 video, which tells you perfectly why Uncharted's story and characters are so profound. But hey, if you want me to talk about the story and characters more in depth, let me know. I do at least want to talk about Nate and Elena's relationship though. To keep a long story short, Nate and Elena's relationship gets strained. After all, Nate kept lying to Elena about where he was for weeks until Elena finally caught him in Kings Bay. Now, considering that Nate felt like he couldn't risk putting Elena in harm's way again, especially after she almost died in Uncharted 2, it's easy to understand where Nate is coming from with this. That said, Elena is completely justified in calling Nate out on his bullshit when she does find him. To keep it brief, Nate and Elena go through many hurdles to try and understand each other. Eventually, they help each other remember why they work so well in the first place. Again, would love to make a whole video on it, but that's for another day. That said, I also want to briefly talk about Rafe Adler for a moment. Uncharted's villains have usually been pretty laughable, to say the least. But Rafe? Nah man, Rafe is scary. He's cunning and manipulative. His entire motivation to find Avery's treasure is to prove that he isn't just a spoiled rich kid with daddy's money. That's really the ultimate motivation for Rafe, to prove that he's earned something in his life. The final battle consists of Nate sword fighting with Rafe in a burning ship, all because Rafe is not content with simply getting the treasure. In his mind, if he could kill the legendary Nathan Drake, the man who found 3 lost civilizations and countless treasures while he was stuck just finding one, maybe he could finally be worth something. Because of all this and many more reasons, Rafe has got to be one of my favorite villains in all of media. He's compelling, dangerous, and most of all, someone that we can understand where they're coming from, even if the means don't justify the ends. In case you couldn't tell, I love Uncharted 4. In my opinion, it's everything I'm looking for in an action-adventure game. Fun and fast-paced combat, so many opportunities for exploration, a narrative that's engaging and emotional, and a villain who is the perfect opposition for our hero. Uncharted 4: A Thief's End is my favorite game in the franchise, and one of my favorite games of all time. It's simply a masterpiece to me. But we're still not done yet. Nope, we still have one more game to look at. God help me. So I'll try to keep this as quick as I can, but this is Uncharted: The Lost Legacy. Uncharted: The Lost Legacy was initially planned as simply DLC for Uncharted 4, but the Naughty Dog team thought there would be enough content to justify its own release. And so, a year later after Uncharted 4, Lost Legacy was released. Lost Legacy follows Uncharted 2 protagonist Chloe Frazer as she teams up with Nadine Ross. For context, Nadine Ross was the leader of the hired military Shoreline in Uncharted 4. Nate and Sam even had a few brawls with her in Uncharted 4. Eventually, Nadine turns on Rafe and locks him and Nate in that burning ship from before, leading into the final battle. Anyway, she's looking to take back Shoreline after this because it was her father's company. Chloe and Nadine are both looking for the Tusk of Ganesh, and their opponent chasing it at the same time is the warlord Asav. Pretty much, Chloe and Nadine travel to India to discover the location of the Tusk while fighting Asav's massive army. Graphically speaking, Lost Legacy looks about as good as Uncharted 4, and it even has the same sound design and composer, Henry Jackman. Gameplay-wise, it's pretty much the same as Uncharted 4, grappling hook and jeep with the wench included. However, this game does something that no other Uncharted game before has done: collectibles that actually earn you something. You see, in the game's 4th chapter, you are given a map to use when finding the 3 switches to open up the next area. You can also see the locations of tokens all around the area. Finding all of these tokens will net you a bracelet that glows when treasures are nearby. Not only that, but the DualShock 4 controller will make a sound whenever you're near them. This is huge for Uncharted, as it finally makes finding those damn treasures actually feasible without a guide. Why they only thought to bring a mechanic like this in the series now, I have no idea, but I'm happy it's here regardless. Can I just say though, that I'm glad Chloe got the development she needed in this game. She went from being merely an inverse of Nate's character in Uncharted 2 to an actual person with struggles and conflict. Same with Nadine actually. In the grand scheme of things, she was kind of just there in Uncharted 4, which is why I neglected to mention her before. Here, she actually has some depth instead of just being another villain character for the sake of it. As for Asav, he's no Rafe Adler, but I will say he is a slightly more intimidating and realistic version of Lazarevich from Uncharted 2. He doesn't have that much of a presence in the game as is, but as a villain, he gets the job done. Other than that though, Lost Legacy is basically Uncharted 4, but with Chloe and Nadine. It doesn't have the compelling story and characters of 4, but it's still worth checking out if you love Uncharted, especially if you like Chloe or Nadine. So yeah, this game's pretty good. Not the best Uncharted game, but a damn good one nonetheless. So there you have it. A stupidly long video on Uncharted that took way too long to make. So why did I bother with any of this? Well, because I love Uncharted. It was one of the first video games to give me a cinematic experience and a fun game to play. The series just means a lot to me, which is why I was less than pleased with the Tom Holland Uncharted film. It just felt like a poor imitation of the games that didn't understand Uncharted's appeal at all. And that's why I wanted to dedicate an entire hour-long video to the series. There's just a lot of stuff I love about this franchise. With that said, I'm going to do something new for these retrospectives. At the end of each one of them, I'm going to give my personal ratings and rankings of all the games in the series. So, here's where I'd rank and rate these games. Number 5, Uncharted 3 Drake's Deception, 6 out of 10. Number 4, Uncharted Drake's Fortune, 7 out of 10. Number 3, Uncharted The Lost Legacy, 8 out of 10. Number 2, Uncharted 2 Among Thieves, 9 out of 10. And finally, number 1, Uncharted 4 A Thief's End, 10 out of 10. Now I know it may seem like a shock to some of you that I gave Uncharted a perfect score, so let me clarify something. I'm not saying that Uncharted 4 is a perfect game by any means. Rather, Uncharted 4 is the perfect game for me. Those aspects I mentioned earlier are all factors to me considering it one of my favorite games of all time. With all of that being said, I thank you all so much for sitting through this ridiculously long video. I'm Arin the Wolf, and I hope you all have a good day. Stay strong and live life.